Good afternoon. My name is Lucy Reinhardt. I think at this, end of the day, I'm the interloper. I'm the chair of the English department at DePaul, and luckily was brought up by two art historians, so I feel completely at home. The English department is delighted to have co-sponsored this symposium, and I am delighted to have been asked to introduce my colleague, Marcy Dinius, who I imagine at the end of the day now needs no introduction, except for that she may have not, her modesty may have prevented her from saying anything much about herself, so that's one job. Marcy's an assistant professor in the English department where she teaches a wide range of courses on print culture. She's teaching a graduate seminar right now built on her current research work on African American abolitionist print culture. And say it again.
And visual culture.
And visual culture, sorry. Teaches on seminars on Whitman, Dickinson, Melville, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her first book, The Camera and the Press, which you may have seen lurking downstairs, American Visual and Print Culture, sorry to read on this thing, in the Age of the Daguerreotype, was published last year in University of Pennsylvania's Material Texts series. In this book and in a new project, Graphic Violence on Radical Abolitionist Print and Visual Culture, Marcy is encouraging us, in the words of one of her current heroes, the 19th century abolitionist David Walker, to look again, which you all remember to do, but my crew doesn't always. To look through the material, look through the material. We often look through the material and the medium to the message or the image without attending properly to that surface. In The Camera and the Press, Marcy tells the fascinating story of how Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass, and other 19th century writers used the daguerreotype, which she conjures here in all of its material specificity, in order to work through contemporary problems of aesthetic, political, and social representation. She reminds us that the early 19th century's first encounter with daguerreotypy was verbal and not visual, that this new technology was read about before it was seen. And in that first encounter began this enduring conditioning that you all are doing a lot today to undo, to think of photography as unmediated. She helps us to remember how hard it is for many of us to see, and to see how we see it. Not least because the image, and this was an irony she pointed out to me, is always already remediated, so here she pays all this attention to the particularity of the daguerreotype, only to have them re-render it for her appear in a way that obscures everything that she's trying to recover in print in the text, pays lots of money to the publisher to get the illustrations of a book that will never illustrate the point that she's trying to illustrate. When I hear Aspen May talk about the fragility of looking, that's what I understand, or when I hear Mira Green note in something that's really taken me back a little bit, that the invisibility of color photography is like the invisibility of whiteness. This is the lesson that Marcy is constantly reminding her readers and her students to register the materiality of the photographic image and the printed text. It is just that opportunity to look again before and after talking, before and after words, at the historical materialities and the widely various representational capacities of different photographic technologies that this wonderful exhibit affords us. So many thanks to Marcy, to Greg, now gone off to the wedding, and Adam, and to all the exhibiting artists for those opportunities. Marcy, you're going to now take it away with whatever use you choose to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Poor Lucy's basically memorized both the book and my entire academic career because my tenure file went in this week and she's seen it many times. So I was thinking I should just have her write my descriptions. Yeah, I thought it would be kind of worthwhile to describe a little bit the conceit behind the show and the symposium. Because I realized we hadn't given that any time, and we only have so much wall text that we figured people wanted to read. So I talk a little bit about that, and then I've just been jotting down some kind of keywords all day, and I thought with what brain cells I have left, I might try to stitch some of them together, but maybe we can kind of do that as a group. But it must have been about a year and a half ago that I started. Well, it was funny. Adam and I met at the new faculty workshop and just kind of sat down next to each other by accident. And I said, "Oh, you're in the art department. What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm a photographer." And he said, "You're in the English department. What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I just wrote a book about photography." And then we got in a conversation with Dean Suchar about photography, and then I was suddenly pelting Adam with questions about, well, who do you like on indexicality and things like this, and realized it had gone far beyond the kind of like, cheese and wine, that these things are supposed to be in, shaking hands, and we started to have a kind of serious conversation. And from that, I started thinking, wow, well, with a kind of critical mass of at least two, we could maybe do something with this new art museum and think about the relationship between history and photography, which is something that I came at through thinking about the initial reception of the invention of the medium, particularly from a discursive angle. And so I was introduced to Greg Harris by Lucy Reinhardt, and Greg said, "Oh yeah, I'm interested in old processes too. That's great that somebody's here that's interested in this." And so we started talking and said, yeah, maybe we could put together some kind of exhibition and some kind of symposium that's just about the relationship between history and photography. And I think 3 copies later, we were like, we're going to have to narrow this down somehow. And so we got to this idea, at least for the exhibition, of kind of 3 working categories. Photography that had history itself as a subject in some way, and then photographers using historical processes, and then photography that was interested in the history of photography itself as its subject. And so from the conversations we just heard, from the images that you've seen, you can see how these categories obviously really bleed into each other. They in wonderfully helpful ways, would not stay discrete, so that when we're thinking about laying out the show, there was no possibility really of organizing it chronologically or even really formally. We just kind of had to be careful about things like, oh, let's not put buildings next to buildings and things like that, or let's not put the ambrotypes too close to the window because the sun will, right, will not help them out. So it was kind of nice that, again, they all kind of bled into each other and really, I think, speak to each other in really important ways. One of the harder decisions that we had to make was, for a long time we had as a kind of, what would you call it? You know how, I was going to say, you know how artists have, but you guys probably do know this, the kind of idea boards of things. The kind of, one of the things that was on our kind of mental idea board for a while was a poem that is in my book. It was published in 1839 called Pictures by the Sun. And it appeared in the Southern Literary Messenger, which was just, pick a newspaper or magazine from the time. Everybody was publishing about the invention of this new medium, had something to say about it. And so, of course, why not say it in poetic form? And the conceit of the poem is that basically photography restarts with history restarts with the invention of photography. Because the photographic record of historical sites will capture them as they appeared in 1839 and forward. And because there would be no photographic record prior to that, then history would effectively restart in 1839. And I thought, well, what a wonderful idea this was, that kind of like everything in the 19th century, that they thought, this is it, right? Everything important is happening right now. And that's why I like to hang out there. And I think I kind of actually believe that in some ways. But we decided, having the kind of ye olde language of this poem on as part of the wall text would be a little overdetermined in some ways, right? that this would really press a little bit too hard on, well, it would do what the poem does, right? It would kind of insist on this idea of starting history from our own vantage point in some ways, and doing that in a way that started to look, kind of, again, like ye olde language or Ken Burns Brown, right? For something that's supposed to look like a cardiac disease. So we decided to leave that off, and I think in a lot of ways that was really helpful because, again, I started to think about history being situatable in a kind of nexus or network, right? And I think a lot of the discussions today have really pressed on that in some ways, that time, of course, as we all know, is subjective, right? But that's something that we have to, I think, remind ourselves of fairly regularly, in the same way that we have to remind ourselves that photography is subjective, right? So I think that's one of the things that I just really, I noticed, kind of picked up on several points today, are kind of reminders to ourselves about, oh yeah, great, of course this isn't objective, it's subjective, but, and of course we know this, but we'll just say it again, in case anybody's forgotten briefly, right? Some of the other things that I noticed, and these are always kind of my hobby horses in thinking about photography too, is especially in the most recent conversations about the hand and the idea of the hand. This is, of course, related in early discussions of photography to precisely this idea of objectivity versus subjectivity, right? The hand, in the mid-19th century, becoming this thing that all of a sudden was evil, right? Was this thing that needed to be purged out of the image, any trace of, and then it had to become fully automatic. But then, of course, photographers realizing, oh no, that's bad for business because my machine is the same as the guy's next door, his machine, right? But I take better pictures than he does, or I want to be able to say that I do. So subjectivity starts to re-enter the picture, literally. And I think we see that in some of the pictures that are in the next stream, right? And as we heard pressed on a little bit in conversation too. Of course, all this is related to, you know, the typical themes that always come up in photography about observation and the place of the observer. But what I was really interested in hearing about at several points today was this idea of selectivity or selection, right? Which sometimes otherwise gets discussed as an issue of frame, or right, the kind of what gets into the picture and what doesn't. How that we can think of as a trace of subjectivity, and how a lot of the artists that we've selected for the show are trying to foreground that. I think some more obviously than others, right? But it seems to be there in all of them, this idea of selectivity and selection. And also in the talks this morning, that idea too, in relation to the archive, right? If you have a photograph that's already framed a subject in a certain way, and by the fact of that, edited out a good deal of information and focused our viewpoint in some really specific ways, what happens when you have a photographic archive that's doing that at a second level, right? Where you have these same kinds of choices being made in very subjective ways that claim a sort of objectivity, right? To compile data, right? Or organize data in some ways. Data was a word that never really came up in our discussions, but I kept thinking about that as being maybe a synonym for a lot of the things we were talking about. But again, trying to present things as objective, but knowing that there's some kind of subjective force or choices behind that. So I think a lot of the conversations and a lot of the images, in really important ways too, were some again more overtly than others, trying to recover some idea of the human at work, and that's become, I think, almost a dirty word for quite a while. But what with the crisis in the humanities, it seems like we can kind of reintroduce that in the conversation and say, no, we're actually really interested in the place of the human again, right? And trying to figure out what constitutes that as a subject or an object, right? And that kind of, in some ways, the almost joke that Greg Foster Rice was talking about, that the family of man has become, right? That's precisely that old idea of the human that we kind of found laughable for a while, but that maybe we're starting to think about again in different ways, return to. And then I think in all of this too, speaking about subjectivity, as Lucy mentioned, my work has turned a lot towards race recently. It's really hard not to do that when you're working in the 19th century, especially in the 19th century US, but especially when you're working on photography. And I thought, if anyone who knew my work very well would think I had completely stacked the deck today on the conversation so that it would really foreground race. But it was not my fault, I swear, or not my intention, I should say, right? It just came up in these, I think, really provocative ways that I was really happy about, because it seems to me, I've now convinced myself that photography and race are inextricable in lots of really important ways. So, that's just a kind of quick overview from my very subjective experience of today and what I kind of selected as important. But I thought I'd throw it open to you guys, and I hate that we're kind of lined up in rows, but feel free to turn around and ask questions of each other, of all of us, like that we can just really open this up for comments, questions, anything.
I whispered this to Opera, John, sorry, I just call him Opera. Just call him Opera. But this idea, I I wrote it down because I was interested in like, I'm not interested in photography as observational, but I don't go to where you go, which is hallucinatory or hallucination.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested in then, it seems like we're always working in binaries in photography, like, but it's just really interesting that your binary is very different than my binary, and I don't know what, I mean, but it's just, that sounds like a disease.
What's your binary?
Yeah, your binary. But it's just this really, and I'm trying to sit here trying to say my observation, you know, which is sort of like a truthfulness opposed to description, I think, to me is the binary, but how you go to hallucination, I find really interesting.
Yeah, well, maybe for me that's more of a, I don't know, a sensationalist kind of thing. I mean, kind of something that, maybe it's more of a dramatic way of thinking, but I think you could also say imagining.
Yeah, no,
Observation versus maybe what's not there, or what we may not have access to. But I like the fantasy of hallucination, that total break from reality where it's completely, becomes something else, I guess.
no, I think you have a
Which,
different.
I guess, psychosis.
Totally got
I
it.
don't know why I think that, actually. Well, my mother was a psychotherapist.
I think
Part of
kind
it.
of the idea of
Maybe why. Well, I don't know.
I think that idea relates to something Aspen said when you guys were talking about sort of the fantasy of objectivity as being a space of authority. I don't exactly know how those go together, but that was really interesting. No, but it kind of points to the psychoanalytic, right? You ascribe to something that can't be known as an authority, as the underpinning for.
I think maybe this relates to it too, and I eventually talked about this kind of stuff a little bit too, but like, if we're thinking about something that's hallucination or imagination or something like that too, there's something really matter of fact though about the way you present these kind of objects. They're isolated. It's almost like it is this lineup of objects, so there's something there that shares, with, I don't know, these matter of fact catalogs or something, these kind of systems even, and Adam's kind of isolation of individual objects that puts it out there for your scrutiny. And then it has this kind of significance, but it also it's really reticent in a way too. I'm curious if you can speak to that aspect in relation to kind of these different ways of thinking about work. If I read picture in a different way, I think kind of how these kind of things I don't know. I feel like this is something that in some way relates to a lot of different work, but in different ways relates to a lot of different things.
Well, I think one of the maybe attributes of what I'm doing is a kind of attention to flatness that I think of traditional observational photography being very much about perspective, at least existing within a perspectival space. So I think one of the things I tried to completely remove was that sense of encountering something within a context. I think it's a little different than putting against a backdrop, because I'm doing things like compositing and kind of intentionally, again, my mind goes to hallucination, but which is I think the benefit of working in a painting space, which is another dimension to what I'm doing, is that there's almost a visual pun conversation with painting, and that has always appealed to me, that painters always had that liberty, that freedom to pretty much place things as they wish, and a photographer has to deal, they only have the frame, they have to, what did Steichen said that, or Steichen, I can work on my history, my pronunciation, but the painter starts with the canvas, the photographer starts with the finished product. But maybe that's part of, I don't know if that addresses, because there is something clinical in the way I'm making these pictures. There's always been that tendency, I think, in the way I approach photography. Yeah, like I said, I wanted to.
But I think it has a lot to do with systems of space, not systems but that, you meet Aspen in some ways annihilate sort of known visual space in some work. Like there's no description of a you know, traveling back or anything like that. And when you take out that perspective, it links to other parts of art, opposed to, you know, Rollando's work, which I also call him by his last name.
That's a good one.
It's the sports side of me, I'm sorry. But Rolando, you know, there's like, you're dealing with the space and the objects, and so you have to categorize them in very different terms, you know, and so that, you know, that painterly space or the trying to destroy, you know, I think there's parts of me that wants to destroy the things that are photographic, and so the first thing I do is eliminate space. And so, and I think you do that in Aspen as that as well.
I think it makes all three of your work feel imagined in a way, like, which is kind of painterly.
Yeah.
Easily index.
Well, sorry, to put it in some kind of historical context too, I mean, it seems interesting to me that all of you who are working with historical processes or kind of history of photography as a subject have a kind of tendency towards specimenization, right? That you're all, like, you isolate your subjects in these ways that are almost like scientific specimens. And I've completely reticulated this book titled Objectivity by Lorraine Destin and Peter Gallison, and they historicize this movement from, or this really huge epistemological shift from, it's one of those zone books, so right, they're aiming big. And so they historicize a shift from trained judgment and observation in the sciences, where you would have, you know, Sir blank blank, right, looking through a telescope or a microscope and drawing out, hand drawing, say, a leaf or cell structure, things like that, to the possibility of mechanical observation, where again, it takes out the hand, right, and it makes it mechanized, automatic. There's no subjectivity, it makes it objective. And that this is, again, a huge epistemological shift. And that, interestingly, that shift happens, right, with the invention of photography. But curiously enough, Destin and Gallison won't even talk about photography as part of this shift, which I see as this kind of amazing opportunity. And it seems to me that your guys' body of work is situated right there at that kind of question, like picking up on photography having a really important role to play in that epistemological shift.
No, also kind of, I mean, that somehow seems like it's related to what, you know, but hopefully you can jump back in something too. Like, I'm also starting to think about like kind of the fragmentation or the atomization that starts appearing. Like we see it even potentially like on the way things are arranged, or my own character recognition, where the body is kind of split up into all these very discrete pieces, you know. And that seems like it's one kind of systematic movement itself too, but I think photography itself also does that. That's like the very essence, you know. Like I have this like Susan Sontag quote I've been carrying around forever, and I wrote it down, and we didn't talk about it, but I kind of want to read it now anyhow, you know, where it's like, through photographs, the world becomes a series of unrelated freestanding particles in history, past and present, a set of anecdotes and fade to bear. The camera makes reality atomic, manageable, and opaque. It is a view of the world that denies interconnectedness, continuity, which confers on each moment the character of a mystery. You know, like this to me is this weird link between, I think, what we're seeing is Eva Meyer's work and John's work, which seems really different from each other in a certain way, but even then Jason's work and others too, you know, like this operation, it's like atomizing these kind of things too. It starts to isolate it, and then you put them next to each other, and what happens? You know, I don't know, like with the connections that are implied or not, I guess.
Yeah, and I love with Jason's work that we could actually hear the story of the people in this community objecting to there being no people in it, right? That they had picked up that you were atomizing their community in this way, that they had a really different experience of it, and kind of violence to that.
I mean, talk about the subjectivity and objectivity. I mean, it was my experience and me taking the photo, and it's not like I was opposed to people, but it was just, I was also kind of treating it as a painter's palette and had gone in with a certain idea of what I wanted to look like. But again, you know, I think I agree with what everyone's saying as far as selecting and deselecting, and I think minor way said, you know, photography is always cropping. You're always, you know, something's always left outside the frame, and you're always selecting.
Yeah, this is going to sound flip, but I feel like there are a lot of people in this room, myself included, who probably have like control issues, right? That this is a kind of funny story there's like almost a will to mastery in a way, right? That's about being able to control things. But Adam, as you were saying, describing kind of your process, right, that also know that there's a limit to that, right? Especially if you're working in, you know, old ways that there's the suspension and you have to, and the time passes and you don't know how it's going to turn out despite your best efforts to, right, to fix it.
I always think about that in terms of like your limitations are your assets
Right.
in any process, right? And it's good to sort of define them, at least in a cursory way while you work. And I think something you were talking about too, I mean, just thinking about the presence of the digital and the construction of the digital negative that's then contact printed. You have all these additional steps of decision making, you know, and possibilities for control. And I think it's interesting trying to like navigate the new possibilities for control, like as being unavoidable. And so it's like exerting a pressure you can't opt out of.
Maybe that's the new fantasy, right? Instead of now, it's not so much the fantasy of objectivity as it is the kind of fantasy of total control.
But there's so much discourse about the accident also, right now
Sorry.
in photography, right? And someone just said about painting, right? You just put everything in, photographers, you know, can take things out, but so all of that accident, I think, is important and interesting to think about. And to me, it's in Myla's work, in the character evolution, it's in all the collodion.
The goop, yeah.
Yeah, it's in the goop, which is also gorgeous,
Yeah.
right? So desire for control maybe, but I think also pleasure in accident. That's my life.
We need those buttons.
Well, this is kind of a really vague and maybe nonsensical thinking out loud, but I mean, this discussion of you know, control and the accidental, I'm thinking there's a kind of, you know, connection or parallel or linkage that can be made between, you know, the concept in the Sante quote about atomization makes things manageable, right? And the Benjamin quote about the angel of history, where the angel is looking down on debris. I mean, you know, isn't in a sense this debris, this explosion, a kind of atomization as well, right? An accidental atomization, which is about like not having control. And I mean, that kind of like, you know, sort of two different ways of looking at things being blown apart and things being kind of, you know, outside of our grasp, I think is really interesting. I mean, I'm not sure kind of exactly where to go with that, but I think it's an interesting sort of connection, potential connection.
Yeah.
Potential, which is another good word to apply to photography.
Right, and latency, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, to make this kind of personal, but about kind of the state of where scholarship is, especially like scholarship in humanities. And it seems all the work that I'm really into and all the only work that I can do now is super atomized. I think of it as like, I always call it kind of granular history, that I like thinking really small. I used to get so annoyed when people would say, why do you just work on daguerreotype? And I was like, well, how could I possibly work on all of photography? It's so much, it's so big, it's so complicated. And I mean, daguerreotype itself is complicated enough. Why can't I just hang out there? Which is what I insisted on doing and have done and still do. But yeah, that in scholarship, it seems to me like recently there's been a big, like that's become okay in a lot of ways to work small. And that there's this kind of, I think, idea, at least in literary studies, that the kind of accumulation of all of that working small will end up being kind of big data in some ways, and it will end up being able to do a lot with that. Or the reverse of it, there's school of literary criticism that's talking about like just, you know, getting, like scanning all books published in the 19th century for, you know, certain word frequencies and stuff, and trying to figure out like people's lives from that. And that's the power of data, right? And so I feel like they come back to that now is often, okay, well, you've got that, like, let's try to work small from that big, right? So it seems, yeah, that's a productive tension on the scholarly side of things, too, not just on the production side, to try to figure out what you can contain, what you can have some kind of control over, and maybe it's like a scalar question, right? That if you can't, when you start realizing, wow, I can't control everything, right? You start figuring out what it is that you can control in kind of manageable ways.
Right, and a figure who hasn't come up today, at least that I've heard, that seems to fit in that kind of paradigm really well is Sable, right? Who is like all about these kind of like small things that add up into something huge, and kind of the immensity is sort of where the sort of overwhelmingness comes to it. And, you know, and his use of photographs, which are so kind of maddeningly kind of ambiguous. They're like so, on the one hand, very precise, and on the other hand, like, I have no idea what the hell he's doing with these, you know?
Yeah, that kind of seeming control too, which I
Right,
think we see in
absolutely.
a lot of the images in the next room, right? Is that, you know, what am I looking at? Right, knowing that a viewer is going to have to come with a certain narrative compulsion, right? Or do a certain amount of work to make sense of it in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also really good.
It's like the idea of transparency does not apply in cases. It works in
Yeah,
next to this. I mean, it does and it doesn't.
right.
It's based on knowledge rather than looking.
It doesn't inspire transparency.
Well, it's like every work, almost every work in that. Not every work, but the majority seems to not really start there. It starts obliquely.
There's even some obstruction too. You talk about Jeremy's work in that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it made it really hard to write the wall cards. In kind of great ways, that, you know, in such a limited amount of space, how much you could actually contextually inform people of, and whether or not that was the right way to approach it. That was, yeah, challenging exercise. Was that a fairly transparent close to our day? Maybe the silence. I think we've all done a lot of work today. Thank you so much for coming.